The murder of Maddie Soto. We're, of course, watching it very closely here. What's going on with who's being charged so far? Just Stephan Stearns, who was the stepdad type figure in her life. Jen Soto, not charged with anything. In fact, she even has some immunity going on in some of the other interviews that she's given. And we have that audio on the channel as well. Joining me to discuss a very specific interview that was done with Stephan Stern's parents, which I found to be one of the most telling. Shavaun Scott, psychotherapist and author. There's a lot to unpack in that piece of audio. And if someone wants to hear it, it is on the channel. You can find it there, Stephan Stern's parents interview. Um, let's just kind of, you got a chance to listen to the whole thing. Just off the bat, what were some of your initial reactions?
Yeah, I felt like I really learned a lot. It filled in the blanks. And again, just they started off with Jen being bipolar and having lots of medication and, using cannabis all the time, they
Hmm.
said. And that would really, I think, help explain why she was not noticing how tuned out she was, that both she and Stefan would sleep all day long. She couldn't hold jobs. And, that again, we were wondering, how could she not notice? And I think if this is accurate, this is a lady that really was not noticing all kinds of things. And so that made sense to me. But, of course, they mostly talked about their son, and I felt they were very honest,
Hmm.
brutally honest. But these are people that have obviously struggled with how do we parent this guy,
Hmm.
for years. They were still paying his rent, paying his phone bill. And at times he would periodically go home. And they were really describing someone that it seems to me has a pretty severe neurodevelopmental problem. He never developed into a functional adult. And I think we could say that it's very likely that being run over by a truck twice when he was 8 years old, the truck ran over him and then backed up. And the mother said it hit his head and ran over his head the second time. I think this left some damage, and that would account for all the different things they talked about. Whenever his lips are moving, he was lying, and it made me think of someone who, because he never developed functionally, he made his way through life with manipulation.
Hmm.
And I think he chose a relationship with Jen for a variety of reasons, but probably near the top of the list was he was attracted to Maddie. And by picking a vulnerable woman, that gave him access to her daughter.
Let's talk about some points that you just made there. The truck running him over when he was 7 years old twice. I mean, now that we know the rest of the story, it's a shame it just didn't finish the job. Then Maddie wouldn't have been dead or been abused for all those years. But when someone has some sort of trauma like that happen to them, does it stunt their growth? Does it stunt them mentally and keep them essentially at a 7-year-old level? I mean, explain that a little bit more to me. How that can have a big impact on neurodevelopment.
It sure can. And it's again, like all things with the brain, you can never really predict when someone has a traumatic brain injury. How is this going to impact them? But we do know that people in prison, if you do their life history, a huge percentage of them have had a traumatic brain injury. And it increases impulsiveness, it increases poor judgment, it can affect IQ. And I think in his case, it affected all of the above. Now, that doesn't mean he's psychotic. He still knew right from wrong. He knew how to attempt to cover his tracks. But even going back into childhood, he was always in special ed classes. And if he had not been run over by a truck, he might have had a better life.
Yeah. Does it affect someone's sexual desires? If you're stunted at 7, are you still thinking like a 7-year-old in terms of that? Where when you're 7 and whatever first grade, whatever that is, like, oh, she's pretty or he's cute, whatever. You know how little kids are, little crushes here and there. Are they still
Yeah.
having those same desires for those same aged people?
I think that's a really good speculation. I don't think we can prove it, but we do see a pattern with sex offenders who are attracted to children. Often they're immature in so many ways, they feel inadequate and insecure with normal functioning adult women,
Hmm.
and they just connect better with kids because they're on that level.
Yeah.
So that certainly can be a part of it.
With Stefan kind of living the life that he did earlier on, and I'm trying to just dig in and try to understand this monster that we
Yeah.
see. Um, when someone has those sort of traumas that take place, obviously he was probably a kid that got picked on a lot. He was probably a kid that was kind of on the outside, never quite fit in. You can just tell that that's very likely what his childhood was like. Is it also a thing where they are interested in children because they're not being judged, because it's easier to fit in with them when you're an adult than you were
Yeah.
when you were a child, and there's less, yeah, just less judgment going on, and there's less resistance there than they would have with their own peers.
Yeah, and particularly when you have a child that's needy
Mhm.
because they're not being terribly well parented, they're vulnerable. And guys like this, they have a radar for needy kids. And I just want to reiterate, I'm not saying that this excuses him.
No,
I'm not
no,
saying he shouldn't go to prison because of it, because in truth, he is a monster.
yeah,
And he had awareness that this was wrong. He knew
sure.
it was illegal and he knew he would get in trouble if he was caught for it. But I also think, his parents described him as spending, from adolescence into his current life, spending hours and hours locked away in his dark room online. And I think we can make a pretty good guess about what he was doing online.
Mhm.
And I think he became sexually compulsive, attracted to kids, and all these factors together just created an awful person who was really dangerous to someone like Maddie,
Mhm.
and a mom who was just not observant.
Let's talk a little bit more about Jen Soto and what the parents thought of her, because I felt like they were the parents of Stefan. They, I don't want to say they were excusing their son's behavior, but they seem to have a lot of, well, she's in on this too
Yeah,
type attitude, and kind of, in some cases literally making some excuses for their son of, well, because of this, this is what's going on, that he's the fall guy. I think they said in there, saying, quote, he's feeling remorse over the inappropriate relationship, he's falling on the sword for Jen. That's a weird statement to make. It's
yeah,
it's like admitting and accepting that your son is probably raping a child, but then somehow turning that around, like, oh, he's taking the fall for it. He should take the fall for it.
yeah,
He's the
he
one who
should.
did it.
Yeah.
Um, that I found bizarre.
Yeah, a little bit of a defense mechanism, I think, kicking in for them. Mom said at one point also, and I think again you hear this from parents, oh, well, he is very intelligent. I don't think anybody can say he's really intelligent. He's never been really intelligent, but what he is manipulative.
Mhm.
And often parents feel better. Well, he's genetically our offspring. We're having trouble accepting this full picture about how bad he is.
What did you glean from the parents at all on how, how they raised him? I mean, I found it interesting how quickly they were to throw him under the bus along
Yeah.
with Jen, which I say bravo. I mean, they're calling a spade, and they're not. I mean, there
Yeah.
was, like I said, we just talked about some little inconsistencies there, but
Yeah.
for the most part, they were just like, he's kind of a loser. It's like he locks
Yeah.
himself in his room all the time. He has no motivation. If he's short on funds, we have to send him money. But he keeps ordering stuff. Just they really just let him. The police have it. Like, yeah, he's a piece of shit.
Yeah.
But with that attitude, that quickness to dismiss, that quickness to really, almost like put him down to the authorities. Granted, there's horrible accusations against him, but it does make me wonder, before all of this stuff started, what were they like as parents to
Yeah.
this person before they knew that he was doing these things?
Yeah. This would be a really challenging, as a child, a really challenging kid to raise and to know what to do with. Even though he had special ed services in school, he probably could have benefited from a lot more services than he was getting. And who knows if they were even available back then.
Sure.
But I imagine that they struggled knowing what to do with him throughout his entire life.
Mhm.
And again, by the time he was 14, 15 years old, his sexuality was off in the direction it went. And there was probably not a lot they could do. And then as an adult, of course, he wasn't functional.
Mhm.
And so they kept giving him money, which probably was not helping. the situation, just to let him continue to live this really aberrant lifestyle. So I had some empathy for them because I imagine that they were pulling their hair out when he was 10, 11, 12,
Yeah.
15 years old and just didn't have resources to know how do we handle him.
Yeah, I mean, they seem like a very pragmatic couple in the way that they talk about
Mm,
things and handle things, but then had a child that was anything but,
yeah,
just in his own world. And I think we see this quite a bit in society where there's one of the kids or the only kid that is just not. It's not like either parent in any way, shape, or
yeah,
form, and not like the rest of society. And you're like, what the hell do I do here?
yeah.
I mean,
They don't know.
how do you parent something or someone like that when that's the cards you've been dealt?
Yeah, it's really hard. And again, different communities have different levels of resources. This is, I see sometimes kids at 7, 8, 9 years old, if they have parents who are insightful, often, professional level parents who have more money, they get them tutors. They give them lots and lots of structure. They give them all kinds of behavioral therapies to try to direct them in more productive ways. And that probably does save some kids. But there's also a tendency with, let's just say, your average normal family who they don't have training in what do you do with a kid like
Mhm,
this. They get so used to it. In some ways, they kind of minimize it and they just keep their fingers crossed. Oh, he's going to grow out of it. Eventually,
mhm,
there'll be something that happens that turns him into a fairly normal person. And they're hopeful,
mhm.
which we like to be hopeful about, people. But sometimes their hope is unrealistic, and he needed just a lot more structure than probably a regular family was able to give him.
I mean, when you have an adult child like this, is it wise to I guess in some ways you look at the guy and go he's not capable of handling anything, so they just keep giving him money and money and money and just kind of
Yeah,
keep enabling that. Is that always the right thing to do? I mean, is that even the right thing to do with someone like this? I mean, because I can imagine someone looking at this going, well, so and so's doing it, but the kid just like lost their job or something, or there was something that
right.
happened. And it's like, well, I'll help you out right now. This is just an endless cycle. Like they'll be supporting this
Exactly.
guy, if he was not doing these things, probably till he's dead. Eventually, probably
Yeah.
move back in with them, and then they'd
Yeah.
be, he'd be their caregiver.
Yeah.
What do you do in that? Do you just let them go and crash and burn? Or I don't know what else, because I'm sure there's a lot of parents that wonder about that. Like, do I let them continue to try and hit rock bottom, but knowing
Yeah.
full well rock bottom is probably their norm?
Yeah, and this would be a guy that you can see very easily with the deficits that he had ending up in the homeless community just
Hmm.
chronically. And I'm sure on some level they cared about him. They didn't want to see that happen, but is just throwing money at a situation like this helping? No, and it's a really fine line for people. How do you demand some degree of accountability? That they do some of the right things
Hmm.
before you give them funds. And
Yeah.
that's a tough road for people to know. To what degree do we help? And to what degree do we say, maybe they didn't need to be paying his cell phone bills.
Hmm.
Maybe I'm assuming he had help getting vehicles,
Hmm.
and parents need to not just give money because that's enabling. They need to hold the person accountable in some way. But yeah, none of us want to see our kids grow up and go into the homeless world.
Sure, sure. One of the other disturbing parts of it was, I mean, the fact this guy worked at Disney. Even and
Mm,
Jen worked at Disney too.
yeah.
Um, obviously, you can't predict certain things. But I mean, should there be more stringent psychological testing done of prospective employees that are going to be working with kids? And of course, there's no allegations here right now that he did anything with anybody at Disney. Hope to God that there isn't.
Yeah.
But I mean, they've had issues before where they've done mass firings and arrests of people within their organization that are out there in the parks working with kids. I mean, is there any way for a business like that works with kids to kind of get ahead of the curve on this and something psychologically go? This is just a risk. We don't have any evidence, but there's something not right.
I think certainly it would be within the law, to do a really thorough background check on
Mhm.
everybody. And I have a feeling if we tried to do any kind of psych test before hiring them, I mean, I know nuclear power plants do that,
Yes.
fortunately, but the police force ought to do that too. And I
Yes.
think you're right. Technically, people who work with kids or want to become scout leaders, we should really be looking at them closely. But I have a feeling somebody would come up and say, you're violating people's civil rights. You can't do that.
Yeah.
But would I vote for it? Yeah, I
Yeah.
would.
Yeah, I agree. You're going to have that sort of a pushback, but is it what does it hurt? It's like if it
Right,
comes up
right.
and it's you're protecting children, you're violating those children's civil rights by putting a potential predator if their boxes check of this person is probably high risk based on these other factors.
Exactly, and we
Um,
know that predators are attracted to, situations where they're gonna be around kids.
which naturally then you'd have a lot of them applying at a place like Disney. So it feels like you need to do that. You need to weed them out a little bit better than if they're just going to work at Home Depot or something. It's
Exactly.
a
Yeah.
different dynamic. Fascinating. Listen with that. If anybody wants to hear it, it is on our feed and on the podcast and on YouTube. The interview with Stefan Stern's parents. Hey, thanks for checking out the video. Be sure to follow us wherever you download podcasts, and especially Apple Podcasts, where you can get advanced episode and premium content on our premium channel right there. Also, be sure to follow us on social media so you don't miss any breaking updates on the stories that matter to you most. We're on TikTok, X, Instagram, Facebook. Just search Hidden Killers Podcast with Tony Brueski, and you'll find us right there. Again, thanks for watching.